Welcome to We Know Finance. I am your host, Mr. B. Today we have a very exciting show for you. We are talking about de-dollarization. What does it all mean? Most people don't know that we are under a petrodollar system. What that means is some years back, the US discontinued having the fiat dollar, the paper dollar, being backed by gold, whereas a lot of countries still has that as the standard. So what we did to replace the value of those paperless money is we had it backed by petrodollars, which means the US essentially says to the rest of the world that the dollar is the standard of currency for transactions, especially when it comes to buying petrol fuel from Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and others. That now puts the value back on that dollar, because in order for any country to buy the petrol fuel, they need to go convert their currency into dollars, which puts a demand on the dollars. And now they can use the dollars they converted their currency to actually purchase the petrol fuel. That is the petrodollar system. Now, why is this relevant? Because we are in a war with Iran. And Iran is attacking a lot of those Gulf states that has the petrol fuel that actually backs our dollars. And what Iran is doing is they're trying to get countries, through using the Strait of Hormuz, to do petro deals in yuan or other currencies outside of the US, thereby removing the strength of the US dollar, which could potentially collapse it. So this is one of the things that actually threatens the petrodollar system, is this war that's actually happening right now, because a lot of countries are, as a condition of getting access to the Strait of Hormuz, they're actually, obliging and doing currencies in yuan, the Chinese yuan, doing transactions in the Chinese yuan and other currencies as a means of obtaining the energy fuel that they need. Or the ruble. I know Russia's also selling their oil, but they're gonna set a different currency because now of this war, and there's a high demand from them, and the US sanctions against these countries has prevented them from legally doing business with other countries in the world. So now if they use those petrodollar system, then that means that it could be regulated. And for a lot of countries that's been outcasted, like the Irans or the Russias or some of the other countries like the North Koreas, those countries will find some other way to survive. Iran's been sanctioned for many and many years, yet they're still surviving, they're still thriving. That's because they've effectively used systems outside of the dollar in order to function. And China is a major producer or consumer of oil energy. So they have propped it up, a country like Iran. But now when Iran is using this leverage of the Strait of Hormuz, they're now essentially forcing countries to relook at, what currencies they convert their money into in order to purchase the energy that they're selling. And we think that it's under attack because countries are now looking at other currencies like the yuan as another means of purchasing petrol. That being said, if that does go out of place, then that means the US dollar is under attack, because the value of the dollar will no longer have the same weight and it's going to drop. Now, to talk about this exact topic, I found a great video by a guy we've used before, Clear Value Tax. He's a pretty knowledgeable guy on topics pertaining to finance and the stock market. And I thought this video would be very useful to kind of get everyone up to speed on this. So without any further ado, let's jump into it.
I want to begin today's video by explaining to you what de-dollarization is. And for that, I brought a prop. Do you know what this is? It's a fuzzy pen. So what's this valued at? Let's just say it's worth $5. Maybe you can get it for $3, maybe you can get it for $10, but let's just go at $5. Okay, but what if the US government told all the producers and manufacturers of these fuzzy pens that you have to stop making these because the US government is now going to be the sole producer of these? And the government also tells you, me, all Americans, that we must obtain these fuzzy pens, and failure to do so will result in you going to prison. So in that scenario, what's going to happen to the value of these fuzzy pens? The value is going to shoot up because there's going to be much more demand for these fuzzy pens, right? That makes sense. Okay. It's the same thing with this. What is this? This is just cotton and linen. You can call this a piece of paper. What's the intrinsic value of this? It's zero. It's nothing. This is, again, this is just cotton and linen. It's a fiat currency backed by nothing. But why is this so valuable? It's because there's so much demand for this. Okay, why? Because if you don't obtain this, you're either going to end up in prison or you're going to end up in the streets. Okay, so what am I talking about? Going to prison. Have you heard of Wesley Snipes? Like, you don't pay your taxes, you're going to end up in prison or in jail. I mean, you don't pay your property taxes with these, what's going to happen? They're going to take away your home. You don't pay your auto loan with these, what's going to happen? They're going to take away your vehicle. So ultimately what's going on is that US dollars have value because there's big demand for US dollars. Now, I want to bring this to your attention. If you want to buy oil in the Mideast, then you need to buy it with dollars. It's the Petro-Dollar system, and that creates big demand for US dollars. Governments and central banks, they want to store their savings, they want to store their reserves in US dollars as well, and that creates big demand for dollars as well. But what if oil started to be sold in other currencies outside of the dollar? What if governments and central banks didn't want to save or hold their reserves in dollars? Then there would be much less demand for dollars. And if there's less demand for dollars, then the value of the dollar will fall. And if the value of the dollar falls, then it's going to require more devalued dollars to buy anything because they're going to be worth less because there's less demand for them. And then what's going to happen? Well, in that case, inflation is going to go up, interest rates are going to go up, and I guarantee you that average wages for Americans are not going to keep up, and the standard of living for Americans will go down. And this is occurring right now in plain sight, and the majority of Americans are clueless. Here's what you need to know. Right now, countries around the world are actively trying to move away from the US dollar, which means less demand for dollars. This process is called de-dollarization, and I want you to know that it's a process. It's not an event. Okay, why should you care?
You're not the only one who gets stuck in debt. You can pay down those cards with a SoFi personal loan. You'll get a fixed rate that's way lower than your credit card, which means you're on your way up. Consolidate high-interest credit card debt with a SoFi personal loan.
Yeah, you have to understand that the value of the dollar doesn't just affect the US government. The value of the dollar affects all Americans through inflation, interest rates, your investments, and of course, the cost of living. If the dollar weakens, then all of that's going to become worse. So most Americans take this privilege of a strong dollar for granted. Unfortunately, again, this privilege is being stripped from us right under our noses, just little by little. And as time goes on and countries de-dollarize, even more, most Americans will become noticeably poorer. So there's actually a way to protect yourself and your family from de-dollarization, which I'm going to be happy to share with you in this video. And I just want to say that, okay, if you don't want to take my advice, fine, like, be my guest. All I can tell you is, well, in that case, like, if you want to be stubborn like that, I'll just say have fun in the future being stressed about money constantly and being miserable and having a bad attitude and watching life just pass you by, because you did nothing to defend yourself against the government's plan of financial slavery. Now, I want to show you this. foreign central banks hold US treasuries in their reserves. You can think of these, essentially as dollars because it's a huge component of the dollar ecosystem. As of early 2026, gold has overtaken US treasuries as the world's largest central bank reserve asset for the first time in 30 years, marking a historic shift. So central banks now hold roughly $4 trillion in gold, surpassing the $3.9 trillion held in US treasuries. So do you see what's happening? Demand that was previously going towards dollars and US treasuries are now shifting towards gold. Okay, a very good question is, why is this happening? Why do central banks want to hold fewer US treasuries or dollars? In other words, diversify away from the dollar. I'll tell you it's for many reasons, but I'll give you the top reason. So the first one is the weaponization of the US dollar. 2, fiscal irresponsibility by the US government. And 3, money printing by the Federal Reserve. Now, let me share with you how the weaponization of the US dollar is incentivizing other countries to move away from the US dollar. One of the biggest turning points in this entire conversation happened back in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies imposed massive sanctions on Russia. And one of the most significant actions was this. The United States of America and allies froze a large portion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's money. It's like these reserves were, of course, they belong to Russia, but they were held in Western financial institutions, including dollar-denominated assets. And once those reserves were frozen, Russia effectively lost access to them. Now, from a policy standpoint, this was meant to apply economic pressure on Russia, right? But from a global perspective, this sent a very clear message to other countries. And the message was, if your assets are held in dollars, then they can be frozen. So it's actually a big risk for other countries and central banks to trust in the dollar, because if they don't submit to the US, then their dollars can be confiscated with a simple keystroke. Now, let's talk about the fiscal irresponsibility of the US government and the massive amount of money printing by the Federal Reserve. Listen, if another country buys US treasuries, that's essentially other countries lending money to the US government. Again, a big component of the dollar ecosystem. And the US government needs money. Like this year, the government's going to collect about $5 trillion in taxes. So you can think of that as the government's income. And the government's going to spend about $7 trillion. So bring in 5 and spend 7. Okay, so how do you do that? Like, how do you spend $7 trillion when you earn $5 trillion? The answer is that you borrow the difference. The government's going to sell treasuries, which are basically IOUs. I just want you to take a look at how much the national debt has been growing over the past few years. Thanks to negligent overspending by the US government. Like, to me, it's actually quite disturbing. Like, this is up to fiscal year 2025. And now the US government is in debt $39 trillion. And I want to ask you this simple math question. How long is it going to take to pay back $39 trillion when you overspend by $2 trillion a year? And the answer is never. The situation has gotten so bad that there's not enough buyers of US treasuries. There's not enough demand. That's why the Federal Reserve has been printing money to make up the difference. So when you have this fiscal irresponsibility combined with money printing, it makes other countries trust less in the US dollar system. So sure, if they buy US treasuries, they're going to get paid back with some interest. However, they're getting paid back with devalued dollars. Okay, so if other countries and central banks are moving away from dollars, then what are they doing with their savings and their trade surpluses? So instead of getting dollars to buy US treasuries, they've been heavily purchasing gold, like physical gold. And I've shown you the chart of how much it's grown by. Now, let's talk about the US dollar in global trade. But before we go any further, let's be realistic about this. Despite all these developments, the US dollar is still the dominant global currency, right? So the majority of global trade still involves the dollar. Most commodities are still priced in dollars. However, as I told you earlier, de-dollarization is a process. It's not an event. And the de-dollarization process is in progress. Here's what we're seeing. we're seeing more bilateral trade agreements being settled in local currencies outside of the dollar. We're seeing countries experimenting with alternative payment systems as well. Now, none of these are going to replace the dollar overnight, but it does gradually reduce its share. And over time, this is going to have real consequences. And I just want to say this, the sad part is that the US government is accelerating the process of de-dollarization. Okay, what am I referring to?
You're not the only one who gets stuck in debt. You can pay down those cards with a SoFi personal loan. You'll get a fixed rate that's way lower than your credit card, which means you're on your way up. Consolidate high interest credit card debt with a SoFi personal loan.
I'm talking about the sanctions and the geopolitics, abusive implementation and bad policies, which is making the situation even worse. For example, I want you to take a look at what happened in Russia. The war between Ukraine and Russia, it's really a proxy war. It's really the United States against Russia. Well, I guess you could say the US and allies against Russia. So the US's strategy was to sanction Russia, to isolate their economy and financially devastate their country, right? Like that was the goal. And while sanctions did have an impact, Russia adapted. It increased their trade with other countries, it shifted transactions into other currencies, and it built alternative financial pathways. Now, again, this doesn't mean that sanctions failed entirely, but it does show that countries can adjust. And that adjustment often involves reducing reliance on the US dollar. So our master plan, it actually backfired and it accelerated de-dollarization. And I'm sure you're not oblivious to this. Just take a look at what's happening in Iran. The war in Iran is a war of choice. You know, they never attacked us. They don't have nukes. The US government wanted regime change, right? And it's also a proxy war against China because most of that oil from Iran, about 90% of that goes to China. And these oil transactions, they're getting done in yuan, which is very upsetting to the US governments. And why is this upsetting to the US governments? Okay, so here's how the dollar system works. If Iran sold their oil in US dollars, then with those dollars that they earned, they would take those dollars and they would invest it into US treasuries. But what's happening in Iran? Iran is selling their oil to China. Iran is getting paid in yuan. And with those yuan, Iran is buying Chinese goods. Okay, so what are they buying from China? They're buying machinery, manufacturing equipment, weapons, electronics, vehicles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, steel, solar panels, etc. And of course, the US government doesn't like this. The US government wants that money for the US. So the goal was regime change, have Iran price their oil in dollars. And with those dollars, Iran would buy American products, invest in the US stock market, and most importantly, buy US treasuries. However, Iran refuses to cooperate and submit to the US. I just want you to know that historically, oil has been priced and traded in US dollars. So that's a major reason why global demand for dollars has remained strong. But now we're starting to see changes. Multiple countries are exploring energy trade in Chinese yuan, in local currencies, and alternative settlement systems. But even small shifts in energy markets matter because energy is one of the largest global markets. And if more transactions move outside the dollar, then that's going to reduce demand for dollars. Additionally, I want you to take a look at what Iran is doing. The toll that they're charging is in Chinese yuan, not US dollars. That's why the US is pretty upset right now. Now, a very good question is, how do we judge the progress of de-dollarization? And I would say that the best indicator is the US Treasury markets. When countries trade in dollars, they accumulate all these dollars and then they use those dollars to buy US Treasuries. So if all these countries are transacting in dollars, there's going to be big demand for US Treasuries. And that's going to give us lower interest rates, which it has been. And of course, lower interest rates are good for the US government because they borrow money. And that's good for Americans that need to take out whatever type of loan, whether it be a mortgage or an auto loan or student loans or credit cards, etc. Okay, I just want to say this. If you're still not following along, like how all this works, I want to explain it to you like this. Let's just say that Michael Jordan announces, like he says, I need some people to lend me some money. Okay, in that case, I guarantee you there's going to be big demand to lend him money because some people just love Jordan, or they would do it in hopes to meet Jordan or for whatever reason. So you're going to have people saying, Jordan, I'll lend you money at a good rate. I'll lend you money. You just got to pay me a 4% interest rate. And someone else is going to be like, no, Jordan, I'll lend you money for 3%. And someone else is going to be like, no, Jordan, let me lend you money. Just give me 2%. You see, when there's strong demand, the interest rate is going to go down. It's going to be the same thing for treasuries. If there's strong demand for US treasuries, then the interest rate's going to go down because people are willing to lend money at a lower rate. Now, let's just say that David Freeman says the same thing. I need some people to lend me some money. I'm telling you, you're not going to get the same reaction as Jordan. Like, do you know who David Freeman is? No? Well, I mean, I don't know him either. Like, I never heard of a David Freeman in my life. So if David Freeman asks people to lend him money, people are going to be like, no, like, I'm not going to lend you money. You know, some people are going to be like, David, I'll lend you money if you pay me an interest rate of 15%, because I don't know who the hell you are. So you see, when there's less demand, then the interest rate's going to go up. Interest rates need to go up in order to incentivize people to lend money to you. Now, I'm telling you, it's going to be the same thing with US treasuries. If there's fewer people transacting in dollars, then there's going to be less demand for US treasuries, which means that interest rates will go up. And that's going to be terrible news for the US government, who's in debts by $39 trillion. And that's going to be bad for Americans that are looking to get a mortgage or auto loan or student loans or whatever it may be. So ultimately, what is going on with the world? They're transacting less in dollars. China, Russia, Iran, BRICS, they're saving less in dollars, so there's less demand for dollars. And when there's less demand for dollars, the currency becomes even more devalued. So we're talking about less purchasing power for Americans and for our governments, which means a lower standard of living. And that's the consequence of de-dollarization. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you have aspirations to become poorer in the future? Like, if you don't want to become poorer for you and your family, then you should ask the question, how do I protect myself from de-dollarization? And I'll tell you, there's many ways to do it, but in my opinion, I believe that the best way to do it is to buy gold to protect yourself. Like, you can buy physical gold, which I've done. You can buy gold on the stock markets, which I've done. Or you can buy gold stocks. There's gold miners, there's gold royalty companies, there's gold streaming companies, which I've done too. Okay, why gold? It's because that's where the demand is going. Look at the central banks, like, the people with the money printers. And the best part is, of course, they can't print gold. I'm going to end with this. If you want to see what I'm specifically investing in, come join me. Join our community on our Patreon sites. I'm going to leave a link for you down below. So over there, you can get your questions answered. You can bounce ideas back and forth. You can join our chat room. And I also have exclusive content specifically for the markets.
Okay. That was my man, Clear Value Tax. Definitely go check out his channel. I think he did a phenomenal job at explaining this exact phenomenon. Yeah, we're in a space now where the country is in war with Iran, and based on how our leaders have managed our sanctions and things on other countries, it sent the wrong message. And the countries are looking for alternatives to the dollar, because at any point, the moment the U.S. is upset with the country or don't like their leaders, they can push a button and their money goes away like that, or their access to their money goes away like that, or their ability to do business with other countries goes away like that. And a lot of people don't like feeling exposed like that, so they decide, we're going to venture out and we're going to find alternatives in the event that our relations with the U.S. goes downhill. We have certain, steps that we could take to hedge away from that. And I think he did a good job. Excuse me. he did a good job of pointing out the exposure, the risks associated with, what happens if you're over invested in dollars and you don't have anything to hedge that. So I do believe gold and silver should be alternatives that people should look into. One of the reasons why Bitcoin, the digital currency, is going so high is because that, especially when the dollar is at risk like this, Bitcoin becomes a very appealing option. The cryptocurrency world becomes an appealing option. And what you're starting to see is that our U.S. government is starting to get things into Bitcoin. It's a big thing for them to move towards cryptocurrency. Why? Because they know the decisions they're making is partly the dollar is partly, essentially devaluing our U.S. dollars. So naturally, there's going to be less demand for those dollars, which means the value of those dollars and the buying power of those dollars diminishes. And that's what you're seeing here and happening. So again, you guys got some tips. He suggested potentially investing in gold. I would add potentially even to invest in silver, because there's a lot of silver products used in a lot of electronics and things of that nature. So the metals are good potential places to look at, but also cryptocurrency is another alternative that a lot of people are gravitating to. And one of the things he talked about, why are these good, is because there's demand, there's growing demand for them. If the investment banks and the essentially central banks who print the money are investing in gold, so this is a clear sign that, maybe it's something you should look at. Now, you got to be mindful because, the price of gold is going up a lot. So it's probably best to get it early rather than later. But he gave you a few different options: buying physical gold, buying ETFs and different gold stocks and things of that nature. So that's it for me. I hope you guys have found this helpful. And We Know Financials, we're trying to help people get ahead of the curve, right? The reason why politics exists is because it has a direct effect on the stock market. And the stock market has a direct effect on your retirement savings, the economy, these type of things, how companies are doing, jobs, all those things all are interconnected. And so it's always good to understand what feeds what, right? Policies affects the economy affects the available jobs and the buying power of your money affects your lifestyle and how you live. So if, there's bad policies, it's going to have a negative effect on the economy. A negative effect on the economy means less and less businesses are going to be able to stay in business, which may mean a lot of layoffs. It may mean that the dollar value diminishes, which means your dollar, due to inflation and other factors, now has less buying power. So if it used to take $1 to buy a dozen of eggs, now it might take 5, which means you need more of that money to buy the same product you used to be able to buy at a cheaper price, right? Now, your rents and different things don't change. So these things start to affect the quality of life that you have. So understanding where the trend is going contributes towards how you manage and facilitate those things. So food for thought. This channel is meant to help you stay ahead and kind of see where the trends are so you can make informed decisions. All right, guys, that's it for me. Thank you for joining. I hope you guys found this video to be useful. And until we speak again, God bless.